Welcome to episode 18 of the Tool and Tie podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 18 of the Tool and Tie podcast. Today, I'm gonna answer a question that I got from somebody, and the reason why I chose to do a podcast on it is because it's actually a project that I'm working on myself today, or right now as we speak. My wife and I are working on it, and the question comes from Colin, who's located in Bowmanville, Ontario, so not too far from where we are. And the question was in regards to finishing their basement. So what they want to do is they want to finish their basement, and they wanted to know whether or not they had if I had any tips for them in helping them finish their basement. So I've got a few fundamental tips that I've sort of put together based on some based on experience with my parents getting their basement made and friends getting their basements made and whatnot. And there are a few important things that you need to take in consideration when making your basement prior to you getting it made, because you going ahead and fixing it after the fact could get very costly and it can get very messy as well. So I've got 5 tips for you that I'm going to help you with your basement. So the first and foremost is you need to inspect your basement. So what I mean by that is you need to inspect the foundation walls and the actual concrete slab that's on the floor for any cracks. And the reason why that's important is concrete is very porous material. So what it really likes to do is it likes to suck up water. It's kind of like a sponge. And it really starts building moisture. So when hot air and cold air join together, your walls can get very, very moist. The other thing with cracks is it lets through water. So you want to make sure that you try to fix that. So here's my tip for you. The tip is if you have a crack that's larger than the size of a pencil, then I would say you need to call in a structural engineer to have them take a look at that, because that's something beyond what a homeowner should be taking on. You could have much bigger problems, and getting it fixed earlier on could be a lot cheaper than getting it fixed later on. Now, if the crack is less than the size of a pencil, you could probably get away with doing it on your own. And the way to fill any kind of foundation cracks is typically you get something like a cold chisel, and you would sort of drive it in about, probably about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch at the most, and then fill it with something called hydraulic cement. And the way hydraulic cement works is as soon as you put it on, it actually starts to harden very quickly. And what it does is it actually expands in the joint, and so it completely seals up the joint. So inspect your foundation walls to make sure there's not any big cracks that can let in water that'll just cause damage later on, and it'll cause mold issues and all that other kind of stuff. So that's tip number 1, is go ahead and inspect your walls, inspect your floors, and call in a professional if it's something that's outside of your comfort zone, or rule of thumb is the pencil. But ultimately, if it's something that you're still not comfortable with, call in a contractor or a structural engineer to take a look at that. Okay, so that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is a lot of homeowners undervalue the value of insulation. Insulation is actually very important, especially in a basement. Basement is a lot different because there's direct contact with the foundation walls, which, like I said, are like a sponge, and they will let in and let out air like nobody's business. So you want to make sure that you've insulated properly. So my tip in terms of insulating your basement is, first and foremost, you want to stick with some kind of a foam insulation. I really do not recommend any kind of bad insulation in the basement, especially if it's fiberglass. You can go with 1 or 2 options. So my preferred method is I would actually seal up the foundation walls with rigid foam insulation, and you can buy SM foam insulation from Lowe's, or you can buy there's the pink rigid insulation from Home Depot. It doesn't really matter. I would recommend at least 2 inches against the wall, and that'll give you about an R10 value. And the code here in Ontario in the basement is R24 now, which has just changed, I think a year or two ago. It used to be R12. And then what I would do in front of that is after you've put up your foam insulation, I would frame in front of that and then use some other kind of insulation, whether you want to go with, if you want to go with spray foam, that's one thing. Spray foam is left to the professionals. It's expensive. It's very, very effective, but it's expensive. What I like to do is in front of the actual foam insulation after I've framed up the wall, I like to use Roxol. And Roxol is kind of made out of recycled steel. It's mold resistant, it's fire resistant, it's got a lot of good sound resisting properties as well. And then I like to cover up Roxol in front of the foam so that and the Roxol's R14, so R14 plus the R10 gives you R24, which is well above the requirement. So that's the second. So that's insulating the wall. The other thing is you want to consider is insulating the floors. A lot of people have a tendency of just throwing 2x4s. They'll put some kind of a moisture barrier, then a 2x4 on top, and then plywood, and then they'll throw on tiles. And then you go down to their basements and you wonder why the basements are absolutely freezing cold. And that's because there is no insulation underneath the floor. So all that cold air is rising up from the basement, and it's going to be causing issues if it's not well insulated. So in terms of a basement floor, there's one of two things you can do. You can buy 1-inch rigid foam insulation, put that down on the basement floor, and then throw plywood on top of that. Or you can buy, so they're kind of insulated subfloors. They're kind of like the dry core stuff. You can buy that, or you can buy the AmDry stuff, which is by Amvic Systems. And those are really good as well. They're effective because they actually leave room for an expansion gap between the subfloors, the way that they're installed. But at the same time, they have these channels on the bottom that let water flow, but also have that 1-inch insulation so that your floors will stay a little bit more toasty than normal. And then the last place you want to consider some kind of insulation are your water pipes. A lot of people overlook this aspect. The good thing about insulating your water pipes is if you insulate your hot water pipes, you're going to minimize any heat loss. And if you insulate your cold water pipes, you're going to minimize any condensation. So very, very important to look at that. It's a very, very it's not costly at all to go ahead and insulate your pipes, and the value that you get in terms of minimizing heat loss is definitely worth it. So that was my second tip, and that was around insulation. Now the third tip is a lot of people will try to go ahead and pull some fast ones and not pull the proper permits. So if you're going to do the work yourself, I highly recommend you pull the permits. If you're going to get the work done by a professional, I still recommend they pull the permit for you. So for example, the electrical permit, when I'm doing the electrical in the basement, I'm definitely pulling an electrical permit because I want to make sure that it's habitable down there. My kids are going to be safe down there. My wife and everybody else is going to be safe down there. And I want to make sure that the job is actually done to the expectations and to the safety expectations out there. So although I am going to be doing the electrical on my own, I still plan on pulling a permit. And in Ontario, again, a homeowner or a master electrician can pull a permit. So if you are going to outsource this work, make sure you just don't give it to an electrician. The company has to have a master electrician to pull a license. Pull a permit. And what you want to avoid is any contractor who says, I'll do the work and you pull the permit for me. Do not even consider that route at all. So make sure you're pulling the relevant permits. And I would say there's 3 areas where the permits are extremely important to pull. First is the HVAC systems. You want to make sure that if you're doing anything crafty with the HVAC systems, that you're not compromising the CFM across your house. The second one is plumbing. Plumbing is very, very important. I know firsthand that water can be very, very dangerous. If you look at or listen to some of my earlier podcasts, you'll kind of see why. But pulling the proper plumbing permits is also very important. There's actually code requirements in terms of the slope for a pipe, and a lot of people don't even know that. They make the pipe completely horizontal. You'd be surprised of how many basements I walked into, and I look at the pipes that go through the wall, and if I put a level on it, it's 100% level, and that is absolutely wrong. You want to avoid that. There has to be a slope on the pipes, and that is defined by your code as well, so that the water can flow in a certain direction. And obviously the last one is the electrical permit as well. Now the fourth tip I have for you is around framing. When you're going to go ahead and frame your walls, there are times when you're going to configure your basement in a way that in today's times, I want to have a bedroom and I want to have a family room or something or what have you. When you're framing your outside walls, make sure they're permanent. So if you want, go ahead and use like something like a Ramset gun and get the joist on the bottom dug right into the concrete. The plate on the bottom dug right into the concrete, and go ahead and use like a framing nailer to go up. Make sure for any wood that's touching the concrete that you use a sill gasket, and you use moisture and mold resistant wood as well. But the sill gasket is very important. That's actually a code requirement here on Ontario as well. And what you never want to have is the wood touching the concrete, because the wood can rot with the moisture going into it, and that could cause a lot of damage, and it could be a lot more expensive. So make sure you use a sill gasket. It's like $10-15 for a roll, and the savings by doing so is immense. So you want to make sure that you're doing that. Now, when you're framing the inside walls, so for example, let's say it's a separation wall, I would highly recommend you use screws. And the reason why I say that is if you want to remove the wall in the future, it's a lot easier to just pull out a Tapcon screw out of the bottom and some wood screws off the top, and you can take that wall out completely. So give yourself the ability and the option to do that. It is really not that much more work to do so, and it'll save you a whole bunch of headache. If you ever try removing one of those Ramset anchors out of the floor with the wood, it is a lot of work. Like you're going to be cutting, and it's so much work that it's not worth it. Just grab a couple of Tapcons, drive them through, make it nice and secure, and give yourself the flexibility if you want to move that wall, out, or take it out completely and make it open concept. So that's something that that we did in one of the properties, and if that homeowner wants to move the wall at a future time, they have the luxury to do so. The last tip that I'm going to give you, and this is a really big one that a lot of homeowners actually don't know, but if you are going to make a habitable space in the basement especially, you have to have some kind of fire escape. First and foremost, if you have a walkout basement, you'll most likely be fine. But if not, you need something called an egress window. And what an egress window is, it's a window that's large enough for a human body to get through in the event of a fire. And egress windows are absolutely a requirement if you don't have a walkout basement. And even if you do have a walkout basement and you have a bedroom, I still highly recommend you put in an egress window just in case there's something that, if there's a fire on the outside of the bedroom, at least whoever's inside can get out through the egress window. And that is a huge code violation. I've seen walked in so many basements where they haven't taken the time to expand the window. And if the fire department came in or if something happened, they could get in a whole lot of trouble, especially if something happened to somebody down there. So you need to really make sure that you're complying with all the rules and regulations and laws. And going back to point number 3 about pulling all the local codes, God forbid if something happens and the insurance company, they're going to try their best to pit it on the fact that you didn't have a permit to do the work, in which case they're going to say it was done unsafely, and you're going to be out a whole bunch of money if something ever happens. So those are kind of my tips. Colin, hopefully that helped you out, and that that gave you the information you needed. Again, if you have any other questions, send me an email at sats@toolandtie.com. Until then, guys, stay safe, stay happy, and stay productive.